deep in the windswept lands of Patagonia, where the icy winds carve through the mountains and the Pacific crashes against the rugged coastline, an ancient genetic story has been quietly waiting to be uncovered. For centuries, explorers and scientists have marveled at the indigenous people of this extreme land, how they survived, where they came from, and why their DNA holds clues to a past unlike any other in the Americas. What makes Patagonian DNA so different? Why do its genetic markers hint at mysteries science has yet to fully explain? Genetic research into Patagonia's earliest inhabitants has revealed something astonishing. Unlike most Native American populations, the indigenous groups of Patagonia, including the Tehuelche, Selknam, and Kaaskar, show a strikingly narrow genetic foundation. Their DNA carries the unmistakable signature of a small, isolated founding group that braved one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. What's even more baffling is that two of the primary mitochondrial DNA haplogroups found in nearly all Native American populations, haplogroups A and B, are completely missing in the ancient genetic records of Patagonian people. This absence raises one crucial question. Were the first settlers of Patagonia part of a different, unknown migration wave? Or did an entire genetic lineage disappear without a trace? Scientists have long debated how these early settlers reached the southernmost tip of the Americas. Evidence suggests that the first humans arrived in Patagonia more than 12,600 years ago, meaning they had to travel thousands of miles from North America in a shockingly short period. But how did they do it? One theory suggests that instead of journeying through the heart of the continent, they moved south along the Pacific coast, using boats to navigate a vast network of fjords and islands. This coastal migration theory is gaining strong support because of genetic similarities between ancient Patagonians and early populations along the Pacific. If this is true, it means that the first humans to reach Patagonia may not have been isolated hunters moving by land, but skilled seafarers, navigating the icy waters of the prehistoric Pacific long before history records any such voyages. Despite thousands of years of genetic isolation, the indigenous people of Patagonia adapted to their environment in ways that defy expectation. The Fuegians, tribes like the Yamana and Selknam, lived in some of the coldest, harshest conditions on Earth with little clothing and no permanent shelter, yet historical accounts describe them as thriving. How? Modern genetic studies may have finally answered this question. These tribes carried unique genetic adaptations that allowed them to generate body heat more efficiently than other humans. Variations in genes linked to brown fat, an internal heat-producing tissue, suggest that Fuegians had a natural ability to stay warm in extreme cold without relying on heavy clothing. This is an adaptation usually seen in Arctic populations, but remarkably, Patagonia's indigenous people had no connection to those northern groups. This genetic trait was something entirely unique, shaped by thousands of years of survival in Patagonia's brutal climate. Even today, the genetic signature of Patagonia's first inhabitants has not disappeared. Though many indigenous tribes faced devastating population losses during European colonization, their DNA persists. Modern Patagonians still carry the markers of their ancient ancestors, proving an unbroken genetic lineage stretching back over 12,000 years. And yet, many questions remain. Why do Patagonian genomes lack certain Native American haplogroups? Could there be an undiscovered migration route that science has yet to uncover? And most intriguingly, could future research finally solve the mystery of who these people truly were and where they came from? Patagonia, a land of towering glaciers and endless windswept plains, holds a genetic history unlike any other place on Earth. Its first inhabitants ventured into one of the most remote and unforgiving regions of the Americas thousands of years ago, carrying with them a genetic lineage that still puzzles scientists today. While most Native American populations share a diverse genetic pool, the people of Patagonia possess a strikingly narrow genetic foundation, shaped by isolation and extreme survival. Their DNA holds clues not only to their ancient past, but also to how humans adapted to some of the harshest conditions imaginable. One of the most compelling discoveries about Patagonian DNA is the strong genetic bottleneck found in its indigenous people. Unlike their northern counterparts, Patagonian tribes show far less genetic variation, suggesting that their ancestors descended from a very small group that reached the region and remained cut off from the rest of the continent. Over time, this isolation led to the loss of genetic diversity, leaving behind a unique and concentrated lineage. Some of the earliest remains analyzed from Patagonia suggest that the people who settled here might have arrived in multiple waves, but the dominant genetic line that persisted belonged to those who adapted best to the region's relentless cold, barren landscapes, and limited resources. What makes Patagonia's ancient DNA even more intriguing is its consistency across different groups. Despite having distinct cultural practices, the Selknam, Te Welche, and Kaaskar all show a remarkably close genetic relationship. This suggests that instead of being separate, unrelated tribes, these groups likely descended from a single ancestral population that later diversified based on their environment and way of life. Coastal groups, for instance, adapted to a marine-based existence, while inland tribes became skilled hunters of the vast Patagonian plains. Yet, at the genetic level, they remained closely linked, reinforcing the idea that their ancestors shared a common origin before adapting to their respective landscapes. Another major mystery lies in the early migration routes that brought humans to Patagonia. The evidence suggests that rather than following an inland path, the first settlers likely arrived by traveling along the Pacific coast, moving rapidly down the continent. This would explain the presence of rare mitochondrial haplogroups that are more commonly found along coastal regions, suggesting that Patagonia's first inhabitants may have been among the earliest navigators of the Americas. If true, this means that the story of human migration into the New World needs to be reconsidered. Patagonia wasn't just a last stop on an overland journey, but perhaps a key destination for early maritime explorers. The question remains, how did these people survive in an environment that was not only isolated but brutally harsh? The answer may lie in the genetic markers that show unique adaptations to extreme cold. Scientists have discovered that certain genetic traits associated with heat generation and metabolism were more prevalent in ancient Patagonians, allowing them to endure freezing temperatures with minimal protection. Unlike Arctic populations that relied on heavy fur clothing and insulated shelters, Patagonia's indigenous groups adapted biologically, developing traits that enabled them to maintain body heat despite their exposure to the elements. These discoveries challenge previous assumptions about how humans adapted to extreme climates and suggest that evolution played a more active role in shaping their survival. As scientists continue to analyze ancient DNA, the genetic legacy of Patagonia's first people is becoming clearer. However, many questions remain unanswered. Were they part of a much earlier migration than previously thought? Did they mix with unknown populations before reaching the end of the world? And could hidden genetic clues still be buried in the icy landscapes of Patagonia, waiting to reveal the final pieces of this ancient puzzle? Patagonia is one of the last frontiers of human migration, a place where ancient DNA holds secrets that science is only beginning to uncover. Among the most astonishing discoveries in recent years is the possibility that Patagonia's first settlers arrived much earlier than once believed. Archaeological sites across the region reveal human presence dating back at least 12,600 years, but genetic evidence suggests that their ancestors may have started their journey southward even earlier. What drove them to venture into one of the most extreme environments on Earth? And how did their DNA continue to reflect this journey long after their arrival? Genetic research has revealed an extraordinary degree of continuity among Patagonia's indigenous populations, stretching back thousands of years. Unlike other regions of the Americas, where multiple migration waves and cultural shifts led to significant genetic mixing, Patagonia's ancient inhabitants show a remarkable consistency in their DNA across millennia. This suggests that once the first groups arrived, they remained relatively undisturbed for generations, their genetic signatures persisting despite changes in tools, climate, and lifestyle. However, ancient genome sequencing has also identified subtle shifts in genetic composition over time, hinting at small but significant introductions of new populations. One of the key findings from ancient DNA studies is the link between Patagonia's earliest settlers and other coastal populations further north. Scientists have identified genetic markers that indicate a shared ancestry with groups from the Pacific coast, reinforcing the theory that some of the first people to reach Patagonia may have traveled by sea. If this is true, it could mean that Patagonia's settlers were part of a sophisticated maritime network that existed thousands of years ago, long before written history recorded such navigation. The presence of rare mitochondrial haplogroups in ancient Patagonian remains further supports this idea, raising the possibility that these early explorers followed the ocean currents southward, rather than trekking across the continent. Despite their genetic continuity, the people of ancient Patagonia were not entirely isolated. Certain genetic markers suggest that at least two distinct migration events influenced the region in the past 5,000 years. The first appears to have introduced new genetic material into coastal communities, possibly from further up the Pacific coast. The second, more recent event aligns with cultural shifts observed in the archaeological record, such as changes in hunting technology and the introduction of new tools. These migrations did not replace the existing population, but rather added to its complexity, creating a layered genetic history that researchers are still working to decipher. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of ancient Patagonian DNA is its ability to reveal not just movement, but survival. Patagonia was not an easy place to live, yet its inhabitants persisted for thousands of years. Their genetic adaptations to the extreme environment, combined with their ability to innovate and adopt new technologies, ensured their long-term presence in the region. And while some lineages have been lost over time, their genetic legacy still exists in the people of Patagonia today, carrying forward the story of one of the most remarkable human journeys in history. For thousands of years, the indigenous people of Patagonia lived in one of the most extreme environments on Earth. But beyond their isolation and endurance, their DNA holds something truly extraordinary: genetic adaptations that may have helped them survive conditions that would have been lethal to others. Unlike most populations, Patagonian indigenous groups developed unique biological traits that allowed them to thrive in freezing temperatures, high winds, and an environment with scarce resources. These adaptations, hidden in their DNA, reveal a story of survival that challenges what we know about human evolution. Among the most fascinating genetic discoveries in Patagonia is the presence of variations linked to cold adaptation. Unlike Arctic populations, who relied on thick fur clothing and insulated shelters, the indigenous tribes of Tierra del Fuego had almost no protection from the elements. Yet historical accounts describe them as living comfortably in near-freezing temperatures. The answer may lie in their metabolism. Studies of ancient DNA suggest that Patagonian groups developed enhanced thermogenic responses, meaning their bodies could generate heat more efficiently than other human populations. This was likely due to genetic variations influencing brown fat activation, a process where the body burns energy specifically to produce heat. Unlike ordinary fat, brown fat functions as a natural heater, allowing individuals to stay warm without external insulation. But genetics alone were not enough. The Patagonian way of life also played a crucial role in shaping their resilience. Their diet, rich in marine fats and proteins, provided the necessary energy to maintain high metabolic rates. Over time, natural selection may have favored individuals with genetic traits that enhanced their ability to metabolize food into body heat. Unlike other indigenous groups who adapted to cold through physical changes like shorter limbs or stockier builds, Patagonia's inhabitants seem to have relied more on internal biological mechanisms to survive. This adaptation is almost unheard of outside of extreme cold environments, making their genetic profile one of the most unique in human history. Another remarkable trait observed in ancient Patagonian DNA is linked to high endurance. The vast landscapes of Patagonia required long-distance travel for hunting and survival, and certain genetic markers suggest that these populations developed increased aerobic capacity. Similar to adaptations found in high-altitude populations, these genetic variations may have allowed Patagonians to use oxygen more efficiently, enabling them to move across vast territories without exhaustion. While more research is needed to confirm the extent of these adaptations, the initial findings indicate that Patagonia's environment actively shaped not just the culture, but the very biology of its people. What makes these discoveries so important is their broader implication for human survival. The adaptations seen in Patagonia's indigenous people suggest that human genetics can respond to extreme environmental pressures in ways previously unknown. But with the near extinction of many of these groups due to colonization and modern genetic mixing, much of this ancient biological legacy has been lost. However, by studying ancient DNA, scientists are piecing together a clearer picture of how Patagonia's first people not only survived but thrived against all odds. Their genetic code is a testament to human resilience, revealing a chapter of evolution that might have otherwise remained unknown. Patagonia's history is not just written in its landscapes, it's etched into the DNA of its people. But unlike other indigenous groups in the Americas, Patagonian populations did not remain entirely isolated. Over thousands of years, migrations, trade, and even conflict introduced new genetic influences into the region. While early settlers laid the foundation of Patagonia's genetic legacy, later events reshaped it in ways that are still being uncovered today. What impact did these migrations have? And how did they alter the DNA of the people who had called this land home for millennia? One of the most significant genetic shifts in Patagonia occurred long before European contact. Roughly 4,000 to 2,000 years ago, ancient DNA shows evidence of new lineages appearing in the region. These migrations, though subtle, coincided with major cultural changes, suggesting that incoming populations may have introduced new technologies, hunting techniques, and survival strategies. But unlike large-scale replacements seen in other parts of the world, these genetic newcomers didn't erase the original Patagonian lineage. Instead, their DNA blended with the existing population, creating a genetic fusion that remains detectable even today. This pattern continued over time, particularly in the northern regions of Patagonia, where the influence of the Mapuche people from central Chile became increasingly dominant. Unlike the isolated tribes of Tierra del Fuego, northern Patagonian groups had more interaction with neighboring civilizations, leading to a gradual integration of new genetic markers. The Mapuche expansion into Patagonia wasn't just a cultural movement. It left a lasting imprint on the DNA of the region's indigenous people. Genetic studies show that modern Patagonian populations carry a mixture of ancient Patagonian and Mapuche ancestry, reflecting centuries of interaction between these groups. But the most dramatic genetic transformation came with the arrival of Europeans in the 16th century. Unlike earlier migrations, which blended into the existing genetic structure, European colonization caused an irreversible shift. Diseases brought by Spanish explorers devastated indigenous populations, wiping out entire communities and erasing genetic diversity that had persisted for thousands of years. Those who survived often intermarried with European settlers, creating a new genetic landscape where indigenous markers became increasingly rare. Today, genetic analyses of Patagonian populations show significant European admixture, but traces of the ancient indigenous DNA remain, hidden within modern genomes. Despite these changes, the genetic signatures of Patagonia's first inhabitants have not disappeared entirely. Deep within the DNA of modern Patagonians, scientists still find markers that link them directly to the first people who arrived in the region over 12,000 years ago. These connections are fragile, and as generations pass, they risk being diluted further. But through the study of ancient DNA, researchers are preserving the legacy of Patagonia's indigenous populations, ensuring that even as their genetic makeup continues to evolve, their history will never be forgotten. For centuries, Patagonia has been a land of isolation, where its indigenous people lived in relative genetic continuity. But beneath this stability, traces of ancient migrations reveal a more complex story, one of movement, adaptation, and unexpected genetic exchanges. The DNA of Patagonia's earliest inhabitants not only holds secrets about their origins, but also about the people who arrived later, shaping the genetic landscape in ways that are only now being understood. What forces drove these migrations? And how did they alter the lineage of a population once thought to be untouched by outside influence? Ancient DNA studies show that while Patagonia remained one of the most genetically stable regions in the Americas, it was not completely cut off. Around 4,700 years ago, new genetic influences appeared, particularly among coastal communities. These genetic markers did not originate from within Patagonia, but instead seem to have come from further north, possibly from central Chile or even beyond. The timing of this genetic shift aligns with archaeological evidence of technological changes, including more advanced tools and maritime adaptations. This suggests that new groups did not replace Patagonia's original inhabitants, but instead introduced innovations that were gradually adopted by the native population. By 2,000 years ago, another genetic wave arrived, this time leaving a more noticeable imprint on Patagonia's indigenous people. Unlike earlier migrations, which were more subtle, this later genetic contribution coincided with larger cultural transformations. The introduction of the bow and arrow, a weapon previously unknown in the region, suggests that these newcomers may have had not only different tools, but also new hunting strategies that gave them an advantage. Yet, despite these influences, the core Patagonian genetic lineage remained dominant, absorbing these external contributions while maintaining its ancient roots. The genetic blending of Patagonia's indigenous people was not only shaped by migrations from the north. Trade routes, seasonal movements, and intertribal alliances likely played a role in introducing new genetic variations over time. Coastal and inland groups, though distinct in their lifestyles, remain connected through shared ancestry and occasional exchanges. These interactions help maintain genetic diversity, preventing extreme inbreeding despite Patagonia's vast and sparsely populated terrain. One of the most intriguing aspects of Patagonia's genetic history is how much of its ancient DNA still survives today. Even after centuries of change, modern Patagonians continue to carry markers that link them directly to the region's earliest inhabitants. This continuity challenges previous assumptions that indigenous populations were completely replaced over time. Instead, the evidence suggests a more complex process, one in which migrations introduced new genetic layers, but the original Patagonian lineage persisted, adapting and evolving without ever being entirely erased. Deep in the genetic history of Patagonia lies a puzzle that has left scientists searching for answers. Anomalies in DNA that defy expectations, migrations that challenge established timelines, and missing genetic markers that raise more questions than they answer. While much of the genetic structure of Patagonia's indigenous people aligns with broader Native American ancestry, certain findings suggest that something unusual happened here. Could Patagonia have been influenced by a migration that has left little trace elsewhere? Or did genetic isolation over thousands of years create patterns that mimic something entirely different? One of the biggest genetic mysteries of Patagonia is the absence of two major mitochondrial haplogroups, A and B, both of which are widespread among Native American populations across the continent. The complete lack of these lineages in ancient Patagonian DNA is unusual because they are considered part of the original genetic signature of the first Americans. This suggests one of two possibilities. Either Patagonia was settled by a population that, by chance, never carried these haplogroups, or a later event erased them entirely. Genetic drift in small, isolated populations can sometimes eliminate certain lineages over time, but the extent of this absence raises the possibility that Patagonia's first settlers followed a different migration path than other Native American groups. Adding to the mystery, recent research has revealed a faint genetic signal linking some South American populations to groups from Australasia, modern-day Aboriginal Australians and Papuans. This unexpected connection was first detected in ancient remains from Brazil, suggesting that an unknown migration wave may have reached South America in the distant past. While no direct evidence of this genetic influence has been found in Patagonia yet, its presence elsewhere in South America raises an intriguing possibility. Could an early migration have reached Patagonia, only to vanish before leaving a lasting genetic footprint? If so, it would challenge the long-standing belief that all Native American populations descended from a single wave of migration from Siberia. Beyond these unexplained genetic signatures, Patagonia's human history is filled with gaps that science has yet to fill. Some ancient skulls found in the region appeared to have physical traits different from later Native American populations, leading to early speculation that they might represent a distinct group. However, DNA analysis has confirmed that these early Patagonians were genetically linked to other indigenous South Americans. This suggests that rather than being a separate migration, they were simply an early population that retained unique traits due to their extreme isolation. The mysteries of Patagonian DNA remain unsolved, But every new discovery brings scientists closer to answering the most fundamental questions. Who were the first people to reach the farthest edge of the Americas? Did they come in one wave? Or were there earlier, now forgotten migrations? And could there still be unknown genetic clues buried in Patagonia's icy landscapes, waiting to reveal the final pieces of this puzzle? Patagonia's genetic story is not just about its first settlers. It is also about those who vanished. Over thousands of years, entire communities lived, thrived, and disappeared, leaving behind only fragments of their existence. Some groups, like the Tehuelche and Selknam, survived long enough to be documented in modern history. Others, like the mysterious Kano people of the Patagonian archipelago, left little behind, their genetic signatures fading almost entirely. But were they truly erased, or do traces of their DNA still linger within Patagonia's modern populations? One of the greatest challenges in reconstructing Patagonia's genetic history is the loss of entire lineages due to disease, displacement, and colonization. Before the arrival of Europeans, Patagonia's indigenous groups had already undergone significant changes, with migrations and cultural shifts influencing their genetic structure. However, the impact of colonization was devastating. Diseases introduced by European settlers wiped out entire villages, often before any direct contact even occurred. The genetic diversity that had been shaped over millennia was suddenly compressed, with only fragments surviving in mixed populations. Today, the genetic legacy of many extinct groups remains only in small, scattered traces, making it difficult to reconstruct their full history. The Kano people, for instance, once lived along the fjords and islands of southern Chile. They were expert seafarers, navigating some of the most treacherous waters on the planet. But by the 19th century, they had almost completely disappeared. Unlike the Selknam or Tehuelche, who left behind descendants, the Kano seem to have vanished without a trace. Some researchers believe they may have been absorbed into other indigenous groups, such as the Kaaskar. Others speculate that their population was too small to survive long-term genetic mixing, leading to their complete disappearance. The lack of DNA samples from confirmed Kano remains makes it nearly impossible to know, for certain, whether their genetic lineage still exists today. Another example of lost Patagonian lineages is the Hosh people of Tierra del Fuego. Closely related to the Selknam, they lived on the easternmost part of the island, but their population was always small. As European settlers moved in, they were among the first to be displaced, and by the early 20th century, the last known Hosh individuals had died. Their genetic legacy is likely intertwined with that of the Selknam, but because so few Hosh individuals were ever studied, it is impossible to separate their lineage from that of their neighbors. Their disappearance is a stark reminder of how genetic history can be erased within just a few generations. Despite these losses, Patagonia's ancient DNA research continues to uncover hidden connections. Some genetic markers found in modern-day mixed ancestry Patagonians suggest that the DNA of extinct groups may still persist, even if only in small amounts. The challenge for researchers is identifying which markers belong to which lost communities. With advancements in DNA analysis, it may one day be possible to reconstruct the genetic profiles of groups that were thought to be lost forever. Until then, the story of Patagonia's vanished peoples remains incomplete, a mystery waiting to be solved. The story of Patagonian DNA is not just about who arrived, it's also about who changed. As new technologies and cultural shifts spread across the region, the indigenous people of Patagonia adapted in ways that were not only reflected in their way of life, but also in their very genetics. While Patagonia remained one of the most isolated regions in the Americas, its population was not stagnant. Over time, genetic evidence suggests that certain external influences shaped the people who lived there, introducing new skills, tools, and even survival strategies that altered their genetic trajectory. One of the clearest examples of this change is the shift in hunting technology. The earliest Patagonian settlers relied on traditional hunting techniques suited for open plains, using spears and bolas to take down guanacos and rheas. But around 2,000 years ago, a major technological shift occurred, the introduction of the bow and arrow. This weapon, which had already transformed hunting strategies in other parts of the Americas, finally made its way into Patagonia. Genetic studies suggest that this period also saw an influx of new people, or at the very least, new ideas. Whether through trade, migration, or gradual diffusion, this technological shift altered the way Patagonia's indigenous groups hunted and interacted with their environment. The adoption of maritime tools also marked a significant turning point in the region's history. While inland groups remained skilled terrestrial hunters, the coastal populations of Patagonia became increasingly specialized in marine hunting. The Yamana and Kaaskar, in particular, developed advanced techniques for hunting sea lions and navigating the rough waters of the fjords. Genetic evidence suggests that over generations, these adaptations influenced the biological traits of these populations. Increased reliance on a seafood-based diet may have led to subtle genetic changes related to fat metabolism, similar to what has been observed in Arctic populations. While these changes were not as dramatic as the cold adaptations seen in Tierra del Fuego's tribes, they indicate that even cultural shifts could play a role in shaping the genetic evolution of Patagonia's people. Another key period of transformation came with the increasing interaction between Patagonia and central Chile. The Mapuche people, who lived further north, gradually expanded into Patagonia, bringing with them not just new technologies, but also new social structures. Genetic studies show that this period saw an increase in admixture between the indigenous groups of Patagonia and the Mapuche, blending their genetic lineages. This mixing wasn't a sudden event, but rather a gradual process that unfolded over centuries, leaving behind a genetic imprint that is still present in many modern Patagonians. What makes these genetic changes so important is that they show how Patagonia's population was not static. Despite its extreme isolation, its people were part of a larger network of cultural and genetic exchange. These influences did not erase Patagonia's ancient genetic heritage, but rather added to it, creating a complex and layered history that scientists are only now beginning to fully understand. Every discovery brings a new piece to the puzzle, revealing that even in one of the most remote places on Earth, change was always happening. Patagonia's genetic history is a story still being written. While scientists have uncovered astonishing details about its ancient settlers, migration patterns, and unique adaptations, many questions remain unanswered. Some discoveries challenge long-held beliefs about how humans first reached this remote region, while others hint at the possibility of lost civilizations and forgotten genetic lineages. As technology advances, DNA research continues to reveal new insights, pushing the boundaries of what we know about Patagonia's past. But what are the biggest mysteries that remain unsolved? And could future discoveries reshape everything we think we understand? One of the most perplexing questions is whether Patagonia's first settlers arrived in a single migration or in multiple waves over time. While genetic evidence points to a strong founder effect, meaning the region was populated by a small, isolated group, there are also signs of later genetic introductions that are not yet fully understood. Some researchers suggest that Patagonia may have been settled earlier than currently believed, with waves of migration separated by thousands of years. If this were true, it would mean that some early groups may have arrived, lived in the region for centuries, and then disappeared without leaving a clear genetic trace. Another major mystery revolves around the possible presence of unknown genetic influences. While studies have mapped the genetic lineage of Patagonia's indigenous people, gaps in the data suggest there could be lost populations whose DNA has yet to be identified. Some skeletal remains found in Patagonia exhibit distinct cranial features not commonly seen in other Native American groups, leading to speculation that they may have belonged to an entirely separate population. If new DNA samples confirm this, it could indicate that an early migration, one that has gone largely undetected, may have reached Patagonia and vanished long before the groups known today. The disappearance of entire indigenous groups also raises important questions. While the genetic traces of some extinct populations remain in modern Patagonians, others appear to have been erased entirely. Did these groups succumb to disease, warfare, or environmental changes? Or were they absorbed into neighboring communities so completely that their genetic markers became undetectable? Advanced DNA analysis techniques are beginning to provide some answers, but many of these genetic lineages remain a mystery. Perhaps the biggest unknown is whether Patagonia holds evidence of even earlier human activity than currently documented. The discovery of human settlements dating back over 12,000 years suggests that Patagonia was occupied soon after the first people arrived in the Americas. But some researchers believe that future excavations could reveal sites that push this timeline back even further. If genetic evidence one day confirms a human presence in Patagonia before the end of the last ice age, it would fundamentally change our understanding of when and how humans spread across the world. As science advances, the mysteries of Patagonian DNA are slowly being unraveled. But every answer brings new questions, and the full story is far from complete. With each discovery, we move closer to understanding the origins, adaptations, and survival of the people who lived at the edge of the world. The final pieces of Patagonia's genetic puzzle may still be buried beneath its frozen landscapes, waiting for science to uncover them.